minutes out of your schedule to join us this evening. My name is Phil Corrali. I am the village manager here in Glencoe. I'm going to be presenting part of our slides this evening. I'm joined by Deputy Village Manager and Chief Financial Officer Nikki Larson. She is going to present some of the slides this evening. Our goal is to try to get through it in about 20 minutes or so. Make sure that we provide plenty of time if you have questions, if you have thoughts that you want to share. A couple of housekeeping notes as we get started. We are going to be recording this evening so that we can post this to the village's website, along with the other 3 public forums that we have had over the last few months. So just giving you that information. And as we go through the PowerPoint presentation, we've included a QR code on every slide. So if you are so inclined, that brings you to the village's website and the information that we have compiled on the research that we'll talk a little bit about tonight, and the work that's been ongoing as the village board has talked about this. So again, that'll be on every slide. So if you find that you're inclined, neither Nikki or I will mind if you try to get up closer to it. If your smartphone doesn't want to read that QR code, no problem. It's a pretty informal discussion tonight. And again, thank you for taking a few minutes to learn more about this subject. I want to get started just with a little bit of history of what brought us to this point, at least here in October of 2024. Going back to 2018, the village board at that time approved a new strategic plan. In the development of that strategic plan, there were discussions around the subject of governance. The subject of the fact that the village is a non-home rule unit of government, and what that meant for the community. And as a part of that strategic plan, the village board included several objectives that led to discussions. Those objectives were essentially for a review of the forms of government here in the state of Illinois, both non-home rule, which the village is a unit of, and home rule, which we are not. And to present that information to the village board for discussion. So what happened was during 2019 and into early 2020, a series of staff presentations were made to the village board and committee of the whole. All of that information is available on the website. That presented the issue kind of in its totality. And it's a pretty significant issue. There's a lot of information. Not all of it is simple. Not all of it is difficult, but it was a dynamic discussion. Taking a step back from that, though, this is not a new discussion for our community. This was something that was discussed at some length and went to referendum back in 1988, but was again reviewed and discussed in 2005, in 2012, and then again, as I said, between 2018 and 2020. If you can take yourself back to February of 2020, we had a village board committee of the whole meeting, and at that meeting, the board had discussion around the information that had been presented and indicated some interest in perhaps putting forward a referendum question. February of 2020. March of 2020, the world shut down and the issue was put on ice while we worked through the difficulties of the pandemic and worked through the recovery from the pandemic. That led to further discussions earlier this year, which brought us to action that the village board took on August 15th at their regular board meeting to place a question on the November 5th ballot. And that question is a relatively simple one that hopefully we can provide you information to better understand. But the question is, shall the village of Glencoe become a home rule unit? So I just want to give a little bit of context on what home rule is. And we'll start kind of with what home rule is, what non-home rule is, and then we'll talk a bit about home rule. In the state's constitution, which was ratified in 1970, there was a new provision included in that constitution that provided a new concept in Illinois. It wasn't a new concept in in other parts of the country, but that was home rule or non-home rule units of government. So under the Constitution, municipalities that were over 25,000 automatically became home rule units. Those that were less than 25,000 were automatically non-home rule units. Non-home rule municipalities are subject to the state. So they are subject to mandates, they are subject to legislation, and if a right is not explicitly granted by state statute, by state law, a municipality does not have the power to govern a local issue. Interestingly, there is only one home rule county of the 100+ counties in the state of Illinois, and that is Cook County. We're not really sure why, but we do know that Cook County is a home rule unit, which is unique for a non-home rule unit of government like Glencoe that exists in the only home rule county in the state. What that essentially means is that in this environment, we're subject to both state and county legislation. And I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. On the other side, home rule units have authority to act at the local level unless there is a specific prohibition in state law. So very simply, if an issue in a home rule community is brought forward by residents, there's no question as to whether the village or the unit of government can act. It's really a question of if they want to. In a non-home rule community, the questions are different. If an issue is brought forward to the governing body, really the first question is always if the village can act, not whether it should. So what that means is often if there is no clear authority granted by the state, you have to find legislative authority for certain acts, or you may not be able to, as the case may be. So this has come up a few times in the last few years. Just a few examples of some of those limitations. As a non-home rule unit of government, you are limited in kind of the term and duration of multi-year contracts. And that term and duration is limited to the village president's term. Why does that matter? Well, it matters when you talk about things like shared service agreements with other units of government. It matters when you are negotiating long-term agreements with service providers that may provide cost savings because of the term and duration of those contracts. We do enter into those contracts, but there is a risk in a non-home rule environment that you may not be able, or they, the other party, may elect to break that contract. We've not seen that issue, but we've heard of that issue in other parts of the state that has caused some issues. Things like talking about gasoline powered leaf blowers. The village was among a group of 11 communities on the North Shore that reviewed back in 2022 whether or not gasoline-powered leaf blowers should be regulated more fully. As you may know, Glencoe had certain windows where gasoline-powered leaf blowers could not be used. And among those 11 neighboring municipalities, we were the only non-home rule unit. Some of those communities elected to do a all-out ban on gasoline-powered leaf blowers. We wouldn't have the ability to do that, though we did have the ability to regulate them. And so what we've done is to regulate them into shorter windows during the course of the year. Things like electric scooters. This just came up. The village president and I were at a meeting this morning with State Senator Julie Morrison among our peers in her district. And we were talking about electric scooters and electric bikes. And many of our neighboring communities, and we have seen some of these issues as well, we're talking about how we really needed the state to take action to regulate them, to limit how they're used, to perhaps license them because they're very speedy, they have the ability to be used by pretty young kids. And it was interesting because the first response we got was, well, we're not sure that the state wants to take any action on that. So a number of those communities that we were present with indicated, well, we probably are going to take action on our own because we're concerned about it. We're concerned about the safety and well-being of our community. And we know that as a non-home rule unit, we wouldn't have the authority to take specific action relative to those. Dangerous animals, we are subject to the county. There is no state authority granted to non-home rule units to regulate dangerous animals in any way. And then an interesting one, you may have seen the Forest Edge subdivision, former Hoover Estate, 12.25 acres subdivided into 29 new single-family lots. The work has started. It was approved back in 2020. The work just started a few months ago. In state statute, as it relates to new development, there are statutory grants within the law that indicate that park districts and school districts are able to levy impact fees, but municipalities are not. Non-home rule municipalities are not granted that. So I've gotten the question, is the village collecting impact fees? Is 29 new residences, arguably 29 new families, an impact to the community more broadly? The simple answer to that is that we are not able to collect any impact fees. I've gotten the question from some folks about what the village does to work with the state to try to get authority when we need it. And I will tell you, it's an active and ongoing process. Today was a good example of that. As we sit regularly with our state legislators, with our county legislators. I saw Cook County Commissioner Scott Britton this morning. We also, Nikki and I both serve on the legislative committee for the Northwest Municipal Conference. We meet regularly with our legislators a few times a year here at Village Hall, and we talk about issues that we are facing. And I'll tell you, a lot of the times, the things we hear are, we'll get to that at some point, but there's not a critical mass at the state level yet, so you're gonna have to wait. So when we talk about some of the limitations that we have, we really do find ourselves sometimes up against a wall, particularly if there are concerns that the community is bringing forward. Just a moment to speak about mandates. Mandates happen. Home rule communities are often subject to them as well. It's not to say that home rule communities never have to deal with them. They do from time to time if home rule authority is preempted, but the state has to take that specific action. We are always subject to mandates, and we have found that that is, from time to time, not a big deal, and depends on the issue, something that can be a pretty significant impact. An example of mandates that came at us from both the state and county late last year, the Paid Leave for All Workers Act was state legislation that did not preempt, or that did not exempt non-home rule communities from its regulatory structure, though there were some protections for non-home rule units. As that was being legislated, we were working with our legislators talking about the impact. One of the primary concerns wasn't so much that the paid leave was going to be available for our employees, but that it was going to be available without reason, without notice. And so an entire group of employees could choose to take a day off, and we may not have a public safety shift that day or a public works shift that day. Those were concerns that we expressed to the state. What then happened after the state legislation was passed was that the county came in and passed its own legislation that was more restrictive, that we were subject to as well. And so that happens from time to time where legislation is introduced, enacted, and then we find ourselves having to figure out how to manage through it. Body cameras, not a bad thing. The Public Safety Department, I think, welcomed them to being used on a regular basis within the day-to-day operations of the department. But the mandated training that came along with it was substantial and without any sort of state support. And so what we're finding is that we didn't have time to ease into it in the way that we might have hoped. And there is an ongoing significant cost without any sort of state support for that effort. Pension funding, this is everybody's problem. This is home rule and non-home rule alike. But what I will say that differentiates a home rule versus a non-home rule community is the ability to deal with whatever pension legislation Springfield may determine is appropriate. How do you pay for it? How long do you have to pay for it? What alternatives are available to you? As a non-home rule community, we're limited, we're tax capped on how much we can levy for our annual pension contributions. We don't set the benefits, but we pay for it on an annual basis. Next year, we are anticipating that our pension contribution will increase by, Ben, it's okay if it stays closed. They're directing people, and that was the library that closed it. We're anticipating next year's pension contribution is going to increase by around $500,000. That's resources that we will have to remove from other areas because we don't really have the tools available to us that a number of other communities that are home rule would have. Nikki will talk about that in just a moment. So why isn't Glencoe home rule? We've talked a bit about this from a population standpoint. Again, no one knows where that 25,000 number came from in 1970 when it was approved. It is a number that some of our neighboring communities became home rule by right immediately as the 1970 Constitution was ratified. Northbrook, Wilmette, Glenview as examples. Some became home rule because they hit that 25,000 threshold, like Highland Park. But the vast majority of our neighboring communities, and as you can see, Glencoe and Kenilworth are the only two North Shore communities from Lake Bluff, south to Evanston and Skokie, and west to Lincolnshire that are not home rule. The vast majority of all of these communities, Highwood, Bannockburn, Deerfield, Riverwoods, Northfield, Winnetka, Gulf, all became home rule through referenda, and many of those referenda took place in the first decade of this century. As I mentioned, 1988, the village did bring forward a referendum. We were the first among all of our neighbors to do so. That referendum failed, but it led to, as I mentioned a moment ago, many studies in its wake, many public discussions about it. And as I said, currently Glencoe and Kenilworth are the only non-home rule North Shore communities. I'm going to pass it off to Nikki, who is going to walk you through some additional information, and we'll keep going. I'll give you this so you can.
So we touched on some of these things, but we took a try at trying to boil down the essence of why the village is considering home rule governance and why we're asking the community to consider this. As Phil mentioned, one of the goals of home rule authority is to allow the village to spread the tax burden. Right now, the village is heavily reliant on property taxes. I'm sure you all are familiar with that. What home rule authority would allow the village to do would be to explore different revenue options that are not available to us today. An example that we have used, although I will caveat this with, the village board has not agreed to do any additional revenue sources. We don't want to preempt or get ahead of ourselves. But one of the examples that we have thrown out is a sales tax. Implementing a sales tax could apply to agencies that attract a lot of folks from out of town, such as Writers Theater, such as some of our restaurants, where you have non-residents attending, and every dollar that we would be able to collect from a non-resident would be one less dollar that we would need to collect from shift some of the burden of our operating expense off of the residents and onto non-residents. Another item would be to provide a bit additional flexibility for public safety administration and recruitment. As Phil mentioned, right now the village as a non-home rule unit is entirely reliant on what is allowed with Illinois statutes. There are some odd things in the Illinois statutes that restrict us. So that is one of the items that we would have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we would staff the department. We touched on multi-year contracts. Right now, the village is limited to enter into multi-year contracts to the limit of the president's term. Although we do enter into multi-year contracts that are longer than that, on a legal basis, those contracts could be challenged, and as Phil mentioned, the other contracting party would have the ability to get out of that contract. Where that becomes important are critical services such as our refuse contract, where our garbage collection services are negotiated, our 911 consolidated dispatch, or even some of our mutual aid contracts that would extend beyond the life of the president's term. And just from a continuity of service standpoint, that's important for us to consider. It's also cost prohibitive to be renegotiating contracts that are more likely designed to be long-term contracts as well. We talked a little bit about keeping decision-making local, having home rule authority where decisions would be made in the village boardroom rather than Springfield or in Cook County. And also ensuring Glencoe's financial sustainability. We talked a little bit about revenue diversification and trying to get away from just having property taxes as our main revenue source. Every year when the village borrows for infrastructure improvements such as roads, water mains, Phil and I sit on a phone call with the village's rating agency, and every year they ask, where is the village in considering home rule governance? The reason being is that a rating agency such as Moody's or S&P place a lot of emphasis on home rule authority because it gives the village board more time and more options to respond in the event of a fiscal emergency. When you have more authority at your fingertips, you're more nimble, and the rating agencies definitely look upon that more favorably than if you're a non-home rule community and your hands are more often tied. Right now, I will say that the village is in a wonderful financial condition, so I want to make sure that goes on the record. And we do have a AAA bond rating, which is the highest bond rating that you can have. For those of you that are not familiar with bond ratings, it's essentially like the village's credit score. But I will say every year we have that phone call. Bill and I are kind of sweating it to get that result. It gets harder and harder to justify that AAA rating. So speaking of debt and bond issuance, the village is currently undergoing its budget compilation process for 2025, or calendar year-end budget. Our CIP program, our capital program from last year, which we are currently amending, has $77 million in needed improvements over the next 10 years. And those needs are growing. Our community is aging, we have aging infrastructure, we have basic infrastructure needs like water mains, sewer mains, storm sewer improvements that need to be upgraded or replaced in the next 10 years. We're seeing those costs go up, just like everyone's seeing costs for groceries and everything else go up. And we have to find ways to finance those. What the village has historically done is gone out to referendum. Why that is tricky as a non-home rule unit is that you are subject to the election cycle of when you can fund infrastructure. And then following the election cycle, it's at least a 2 to 3 month process to issue bonds, going through the rating agency process, going to market, and initiating the borrowing. That makes it difficult to time the market. Obviously, if Phil or I could time the market, we'd probably be living in Hawaii or somewhere exotic right now. But there is still a very long time period where the village has to react to any changes in the market. So when we've seen interest rates rise, or we know a Fed rate interest rate is coming, an increase is coming, we have no ability to react to that or expedite our process because as a non-home rule unit, The other piece of this is as a non-home rule unit, the village is limited to borrowing at a term of no longer than 20 years. That sounds like a long time, but when you're thinking about a water treatment plant that is approaching 100 years old, our village hall is approaching 70 years old, and many of our water mains or our sanitary sewer mains can have useful lives of up to 60 years. If we borrow for improvements, and it's only over a 20-year time period, the cost of that infrastructure improvement is all front-loaded in that 20-year time period. So the residents of today, everyone that's living here for the next 20 years, is paying the cost of that entire improvement, even though the benefit of that improvement may last another 40 years beyond that initial debt repayment. So what that does is artificially inflate our debt costs. It's kind of like having a 10-year mortgage versus a 20-year mortgage, right? You're front-loading that cost, and then if you move out of the village, your neighbors that come into your home aren't paying any of that cost for that infrastructure improvement. And again, that does help maintain our AAA credit rating, having the ability to borrow over longer periods of time. So we talked a lot about property taxes this evening. Although home rule communities are not subject to a property tax cap, right now the village as a non-home rule unit is subject to a property tax cap that's determined every year by the state of Illinois, by the Department of Revenue, and it's the lower of 5% or the 12-month increase in CPI. What the village board has promised to do and essentially committed to do via resolution is to continue to abide by that property tax cap. Many of our neighbors, as Phil mentioned, that have gone to referendum by vote have also committed to this promise. I know Winnetka is one of them, Lake Forest is one of them. They've also made similar commitments to their community that they have abided by as well.
There's a question.
Yes, sir.
This home rule, you show that Glencoe's piece of the pie is 15.44%. Does the home rule mean just the village? Does it mean the park district? Does it mean the library? Does it mean the schools? Because while you may agree non-bindingly to do that, you know, the people, the park district has been pretty, they'd spend a lot of money if they could. And that's much bigger percentage of all those, and you only have a small piece. So is home rule for everybody?
That's a great question, and thank you for clarifying that. So the village right now is 15% of the property tax bill. The rest of the taxing bodies that would cover your home in Glencoe do not have the ability to become home rule. So they would be subject to the property tax regardless, unless they went out for referendum. They went out for the referendum, and the community approved an additional taxing dollar, they would be able to exceed that cap. But in this case, this would only apply to the village. Good question, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and just one final note on property taxes, if you do visit the village's website, we have done some studies of the village's surrounding communities, because one of the feedback items that we've heard is that if you're a home rule community, your taxes will become higher. What we have looked at our website, and you can see the actual comparisons, is that that's actually the reverse is true, because what we have found anecdotally with our neighbors is that the home rule communities have different revenue options that they can tap into to again try to shift that tax burden away from the residents. And what we're finding is that non-home rule communities, because they rely so heavily on property taxes, comparable homes in other communities, our tax bills are actually higher than what we're seeing in some of the home rule neighbors in the area. Another question that we've received is whether or not the village will implement real estate transfer tax. If you're not familiar with transfer taxes, we do not have one here. It's essentially a tax on the transfer of property. So if you go to sell your home in certain communities, there is a tax that can be enacted on that sale and that requires an entirely separate referendum. So I just want to clarify that the village has no intention of enacting such a tax, and if that discussion were ever to happen with the village board, that would come before the community as a separate entity. So I just want to clarify that that's not,
Has no plans and no ability.
both.
So
No
if this
plans and no
referendum passes, the village still has no ability to enact it
Correct.
without coming to the.
The second referendum.
Yes, so it would have to be an entirely separate referendum authorizing that. Thank you for the question. Okay, and we have that.
We talked about a bit of this, I won't be repetitive. Just a couple of things to note. There are some additional flexibility points that we do sometimes get questions about, especially as they relate to sustainability, as they relate to historic preservation. We do have limitations on ways to adjust our zoning regulations, for instance, to provide additional ways to keep historic structures intact. That usually involves variations that exceed the village's authority. Those are points that some of our neighboring communities who have more robust historic preservation regulations sometimes are able to put into practice. One point I wanted to make, and it ties back to some of the things Nikki has pointed to, is the potential for funding opportunities relative to grants. The village very gratefully has been the recipient of both state and federal grants for certain discrete projects. Most recently, about $800,000 from the state of Illinois to help rebuild the retaining wall on the ramp taking you down to both the water plant and the Glencoe beach, a partnership project that we worked on with the Park District. But one of the things that I think is helpful to understand here is to look at an example in a neighboring community, and that neighboring community is Glencoe. Glencoe, several years ago, embarked on a very ambitious stormwater management plan that they are nearing completion of. It's in the neighborhood north of $80 million in total cost. And in fact, they've only just issued their first round of debt for that project because of their ability to leverage their taxing authority to move forward on a fairly quick basis to get a lot of federal money into that project to the tune of about $30 million. And they also aggregated other resources. That's important because what we sometimes find when we are seeking these grant funding opportunities is that there's a very discrete time frame within which those dollars have to be spent. And as Nikki was pointing out to you a moment ago, as we talk about the referendum process relative to infrastructure projects, sometimes that window can be a couple of years. And as we go to our legislators, often they want to see those dollars put to work immediately. And we have missed out on some of those projects and some of those dollars in the past. We want those dollars invested in this community. That means we are levying less, you are paying less, the overall cost immediately to Glencoe is less. And that has been an issue that has kind of flustered some of our capital planning efforts. So there are concerns, right? We certainly recognize those. We want to talk a little bit about them. Nikki pointed to the real estate transfer tax. It's one of the more frequent questions that we receive. When's the village going to enact it? If you do this, it's going to cost us additional resources. There's no doubt that if a real estate transfer tax were put into place, that would be an impact to the community, but it would be an impact that would be discussed at Village Hall, and that voters would have the ability to dialogue, consider, and then vote on through a referendum process. As we pointed out, that isn't something that is being proposed and would take many extra steps. So I do want to just kind of underscore that. I will say, home rule is not a magic, yep.
How expensive is that transfer tax?
Well, I think it depends. You know, there are some communities, I think, that levy $2 per thousand up to $5 per thousand of sale price. Some of those communities have kind of structured what those resources are to be used for, like forests, for example, Those dollars are only used to fund infrastructure investments. Others, well, Met, for example, funds their general fund with them, so they see that as a revenue stream. But that's what we've seen is usually, $2 to $5 per thousand of sale price. This is something I tell people all the time. Home rule isn't a magic wand, right? It will not make all of our concerns, issues, community-wide questions disappear. What it does is it provides flexibility. It provides us with the ability to consider alternatives that perhaps may not be available to us today that can get done what we know as a community we may need to get done. I do think it's important to point to the fact that the decisions that we talk about as it relates to the village board and the actions that they take happen in the building just next door to us, in the council chambers on the second floor of Village Hall. Being able to be engaged and be able to dialogue with your local elected officials who live down the street from you and who are making decisions that impact them as well is a different context sometimes than dealing with those elected officials who may be down in Springfield. Being able to have a discussion with an elected official here in downtown Glencoe as opposed to over the phone or through email. There is some significant value to that, but that's also a concern, right? That's a concern that some folks have said, this gives the village board too much authority. I'm not comfortable with that. And I think the point that we have tried to make is that you do have access in a way at the local level that you are often not granted at the state level. And I think an important point to make is that the state does still maintain some control. I mentioned before that there are legislative activities that the state has taken or that the county has taken that preempt home rule authority, that exert its authority over all units of local government. That's still true. But I do think home rule units of government still have more tools at their disposal to figure out how to deal with that. I do want to make a couple of quick points to underscore something that Nikki said. The village is probably in the best financial condition that it's been in generations. Our resources have been well managed and well maintained. The village board is proactive and thoughtful about how resources are allocated. The growth of our budgets has been minimized, and yet we've made pretty substantial investments in the community. Dialing back to our capital investments that we know we're going to have to make, that $77 million number that Nikki pointed to doesn't include the long-term solutions on our water treatment facility. That's a subject that comes up from time to time. Glencoe is unique in that we produce water for ourselves. We are open to ideas and open to options of partnering with a neighboring municipality to perhaps get water from them. But what we know is no matter what decision is made, whether there's a significant investment made in our own water plant or a partnership effort with a neighboring municipality or water agency, there's a substantial cost that goes along with that. And by substantial, I mean tens of millions of dollars bordering up to $100+ million. For a community our size, we want to be very conscious and thoughtful about that. Home rule provides some reassurances, I think, to the community that that debt isn't going to be front-loaded, that those efforts have the ability to be spread over time and thoughtfully enacted, as opposed to a really significant upfront cost. But I do think it's important also to underscore, tying back to the local control piece, that our financials are transparent. I hope you've had the opportunity to see it, but if you haven't, I'd encourage you to take a look. Nikki and her team prepare a monthly treasurer's report with as much detail as you're going to find from any unit of government relative to the financial condition of the village. It talks about trends. It looks at how our sales tax are coming in, the delay raise in property taxes, how we are doing from the standpoint of the expenditures that are anticipated in the course of the year. And all of that remains in place. All of that, the efforts and the work that we have done over generations, this is far predates me and Nikki, and the current village president and village board, will remain in place. The concepts of frugality and thoughtfulness in the way resources are allocated is very much front of mind and very much a part of this conversation. And I think that's particularly important to underscore.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, please.
You say that we're in good financial condition. On the other hand, you say we have this water filtration plant that could cost $100 million, which is, for a community this size, is astronomical.
Sure is.
So, isn't that like, what was done to anticipate in the past, even today? And why do you say we're in such good shape when we have this $100 million expenditure that we have to pay?
I would say because the village of Glencoe has plans that have been in place for generations to make sure that we are making investments across the spectrum of investments that we have to make. Our water plant is one very large, very expensive piece of our infrastructure. We have 58 linear miles of streets. We have 45 miles of sidewalks. Underneath those streets and sidewalks, we have water mains, and we have storm sewers and sanitary sewers. So the investments have been made over all of our infrastructure. We haven't neglected the water treatment plant. The water treatment plant produces water at the highest quality. Our EPA readings are exactly where they need to be. What we are starting to do is to put the pieces in place to make sure that the work that we're doing today, because I'll tell you, a treatment plant is a long runway project. We're talking 10, 15, 20 years from now before something would be in place. The idea here is to make sure that we are continuing that history of pre-planning, of thoughtful planning for those kinds of investments, so that it isn't a surprise, it isn't an emergency, and it isn't something that we have to make a quick decision.
So how do you expect the community to be effective to make that large investment? Will our taxes go up? How are we gonna pay for it?
Well, and that's why I said there are a number of options that we are looking at. Not all of them cost the same. What we are starting to do is to understand the impact and the magnitude of those options. We had a 4-hour meeting with the village board earlier this year, outlining our water distribution system and our water treatment plan, talking about the areas that we know we have to invest, the concerns that are out there, what may be changes in the EPA standards that we would be subject to, how we're gonna deal with new federal regulations. They were announced today. There were federal regulations announced a few years ago that mandate that we are working to replace all lead service lines in the community. Thankfully, this is an effort that we've had underway for a number of years, and about 15% of our community still has lead service lines. We actually have no lead in the public system, but how are we gonna pay for that? I will tell you the simple answer to your question is we don't know exactly how or exactly how much those projects are gonna cost, but we do know that the planning that we have to do needs to start now, because we have to make sure that it isn't something that comes as a surprise, that is overwhelming to the community. But it speaks back to Nikki's point before about this duration, the terms of debt, right? If you're talking about something of that magnitude, you really don't want to pay for it over 20 years. You want to find a way to extend the term of the cost to a generation or two that are going to benefit from it. Our plant was constructed and opened in 1928, significantly increased in size in 1954. Most of the people living in this community were definitely not alive in 1928. Some may have been alive in 1954, but those investments were made and paid off, and the continued investment has remained. what we don't wanna see is that a generation of Glencoe, residents suddenly responsible for that whole cost. It is a thoughtful process, it is one that has a myriad of options. There's no one right answer, but I will tell you, the intention with a project like that, like every significant project that we do, is that those decisions are made here among the elected officials that are your neighbors. And I think that's an important point to underscore.
If I could, cause that's a good question. I'm Howard Rowan, I'm the village president. At the first of our meetings, one of our residents, raised her hand and she said, "What is wrong with you people? Why haven't you been saving money for the last 50 years so we have enough money to do a new water plant or whatever we're gonna do?" Just as somebody would do if they want to send their children to college. And when you're talking about sending your children to college, if you have the luxury of saving up so you can pay for them, that's a good idea. But we are not equivalent in the village to sending our kids to college because, you know, I'm 71. I'm not gonna be here in 20 or 30 years. And many of you aren't gonna be here, maybe you're gonna move, different people. So it's not fair to the current residents, or it wouldn't have been fair to the residents for the last 50 years to say, we're gonna tax you so that you can rebuild the water plant in 2030 or 2035. The way, so it's not that we were irresponsible or profligate over the last 50 years by not taxing everybody to pay for something in the future. The way it's done is we figure out what we're gonna do, and then through, we hope, grants, you know, build better, build back better. We hope then with bonds, with a long trajectory, that we're able to pay for these really expensive projects. So the goal here is not to tax the current residents to death. It's not to, we don't want our current residents to pay for something they're not gonna get. The goal is to find a way to pay, the people pay for it, get it. And that's why. And I will say, one of the reasons that I'm for home is that I think it's hard to finance a huge project that's gonna last for 40 years with a 20-year bond. It's hard to get enough money. And it's unfair to the current residents to say, you've gotta pay in 20 years for something that the residents are gonna benefit from for 40 or 50 years. But we don't have that luxury when we're not a home rule unit.
If I can also just address your
Thank you.
original question. Thank you, President Rowan. The decision has not been made yet. Even though we do have an aging water plant, we're still too early in the stages of discussion with the village board to determine what the exact dollar figure is. The $77 million that I mentioned earlier is the next 10 years of infrastructure investment, and as Phil mentioned, we won't be replacing anything or making any movements, significant movements in the next 10 years. What that is included in that 77 million is infrastructure improvements to continue to maintain our existing water plant, because we know we have a responsibility in the community to continue to maintain that asset. But we have a lot of conversations still to go to determine what is the pathway forward. And that workshop, that water workshop, I think is still up on our website if anyone's interested in watching 4 hours, or you can fast forward to the highlights.
It's actually very interesting.
It is
I think.
interesting. But there are several options that we are pursuing, all with different cost points. And even, you know, buying water from somewhere else or becoming a water partner with someone else. But any of those have a cost attached to it. So before we really want to start borrowing or financing anything, we first need to have public discussions to make a way forward, and then we'll go from there. But I think Phil's point was, and President Rowan was, how do we most responsibly finance that so it's affordable to the community and choose the right pathway forward? So I think there are still conversations that have to happen before we go down this
not directly related to the water plant, I don't wanna interrupt that if somebody wants to continue. I just have a simple question. You mentioned that the board had a resolution, to keep property taxes capped at 5%. My only worry is that, you know, boards change over time. When my husband and I lived in Glencoe since 1975, we're in dirt, and our taxes then were $2,400 a year, and I can't tell you what our taxes are now because I'll get a rash. But, if I would really like something more than just, good intentions about keeping that going forward.
And that is a good point. I will say that the board passed a resolution at this point in time because it would be a little bit preemptive before we find out what the community would like to do. What their intention would be is to codify that intention into the code of ordinances of the village. If the referendum were to pass, we would codify that in the rest of the laws that the village has. That doesn't mean it can't be undone by a future board. So I'll be very transparent with you, but to undo that, it would take a public action of the board at a public meeting to violate or to go above and beyond that.
So one point I wanna make to that, because the question was asked of how could we attach it to the referendum question? We can't. The questions are set by statute. We wanted to perhaps do a trigger ordinance so that if the referendum passed, it would automatically go into effect. Because we're not home rule, we can't do a trigger ordinance. So it's interesting that the village board has been very thoughtful about that, but those limitations exist in ways that really you kind of scratch your head and say, but if that's the intention, why can't that work? And it's the way statutory authority is granted, it's unique. But to Nikki's point, yeah, it could be something that changes in the future. Those are, that's going back to kind of the risk, that's an aspect of the risk.
Well, I know our community is very diverse economically speaking, and, is it ever legal to have anything that is income-based to taxes, or is that illegal? In other words, you know, if somebody didn't have income of $1 million a year.
We unfortunately don't set tax law. It's handled at the county level. Even in a home rule environment, those are all statutorily mandated in the way that they're structured. And unfortunately, now there are programs that are available to help cap property taxes for income, for senior freeze and things like that.
Well, I'm not on the curve with the tin cup, but I just
Yeah.
was hoping
I
that
understand.
there would be some
That's a
kind
good
of.
question, yeah.
I have two questions. So when NACA did their flood remediation project, I'm sure they obviously must have issued a ton of debt.
Not a ton,
Well,
from what we understand.
So what was the duration of their debt?
They've not issued it yet.
They are planning to issue it, but they're doing a 30-year
I think it's
issue.
a year.
Yeah.
And that's significantly greater than 20. It's not 40 or 50 years.
No, I think they could go longer than 30, but I think that they determined that was the appropriate term. I don't wanna speak for them, but based off of the conversations we've had with their staff.
My second question is, I'm 33-year resident in Glencoe.
You are.
I win.
You weren't even born.
No, I'm sure you win, there's others. So the non-home rule has been our only, my property tax bill is quadrupled in those 33 years I've been here, but it's been our only restrictor plate on actually having truly a say on the debt levels.
Sure.
And home rule has failed before, it's failed many times. And it's primarily been around that issue, you know, the residents are very generous. I mean, there's only been in my 33 years, one referendum that failed, because we had a predecessor to you who had his best interest at heart, but not ours, and he brought forward a $6 million referendum that was full of stuff that couldn't explain it. And so, you know, we've been generous, and you know, and we're smart, and we can, you know, obviously if there's a need, we vote yes. I understand the other flexibility, but you know, putting a sales tax in the village and expecting someone from Winnetka eating at Guildhall or going to Writers Theater is going to change that 95% very much, is pretty optimistic in my opinion. You know, our big savior was getting the Mercedes-Benz and the CarMax under James Webb, and that's done tremendous things for the village's overall budget, but we're still at 95% property tax. I mean, that's not going to change.
55%.
Okay, it's not going to change much from there, I don't think. We don't have any land, I don't see any car dealerships coming, but anyhow, I don't, you know, part of me is like, yeah, I appreciate all the other bells and whistles you may get, but as a resident, I appreciate having, that restrictor plate and being able to, you know, have a say, on the debt levels. And, you know, there are obviously always well-meaning people, you know, but there are bad actors who come along every so often. We've had village board presidents who, you know, lost the faith in the trust of the community in my 33 years, and we've had a village manager who, you know, didn't last long and put that $6 million in front of us. So anyways, maybe you can persuade me why I'm thinking about this incorrectly.
You know, as a potential bad actor, you know, we try not to be bad actors.
Of course not.
Let me just say, so Winnetka, I'm so jealous of their ability to do a huge stormwater project, and they haven't even had to do the bonds yet, because they were able to, and it's really because they're home rule and they are not limited, they're able to make deals that get them grants that are very hard for us to get. We get some, but, and then one thing you brushed off is you said, well, it's only a 30-year bond, it's not 40. Well, we're at 20. It's just a math problem to see the difference in what you currently pay between 30 and 20, and it's, you know, over a period of, you know, 20 years, it's not a small amount of money. The goal here is not to find a way for us to tax our residents more. That's not the goal. The village is, we're almost always timid. It's almost, I really almost never see the village get ahead of the residents. If most residents want something and 30 people show at a meeting, the village usually folds, even though it's only 30 people. I wish we were a little better at that if we know what residents think. But the goal of you know, I'm speaking for my, you know, why am I for it? It's not because I want to raise our taxes, you know. I didn't get involved in this to raise our taxes. I would like us to be able to pay less for what we get. And so the idea is, I would like the village to have the same authority that basically all of our neighbors have, so we can do things that our residents want, which all of our neighbors, you know, Wilmette, Winnetka, Northfield, Northbrook, Highland Park, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, Bannockburn, Bering, you know, all of them, some are red towns, some are blue towns, some are purple towns. All of those governments have that authority we're asking for, so we can do more for our residents. And the bond thing is just an example. I would like our residents to be able to pay less, the current residents pay less for the water plant or the water infrastructure. Even if whatever we do on water, we have to continue to update our water infrastructure. It's expensive, but it lasts. I'd like us to be able to pay less. That's why.
Thank you.
I just had a couple quick questions. We have only lived in the village of Glencoe for about a year. We came from Dallas. There's a whole nother political nightmare. But our property taxes were very, very, very high. We were in the Tunnel Park area. And when we moved here, our taxes in general doubled. And we were already in a very, very high tax area. And since we've been here, we've gotten a letter about our lead pipe situation, which I guess we have to have done within X amount of time, it's gonna be about $10,000. There just seems to be a lot of things that, as much as you're saying you don't wanna put the burden on the residents, that there is quite a bit of burden that I haven't experienced living in either red or blue states. So I don't know if it's a political thing or not, but that being said, what I hear you saying is that you guys don't wanna raise the taxes to do things like pay for the water plant. But I don't, and that you guys wanna shift the tax burden, but what I don't hear is that how you guys are gonna make that work. So you don't wanna raise taxes, but we need to pay for this, but you don't want us to pay as much now, like there's a disconnect there, I guess, for me, on what you guys are saying. I think that's my first concern. My second concern is what many people have told me, trying to explain this concept, is that things like our speeding tickets or parking tickets, those kind of things are gonna go up astronomically. Not that I've gotten any, but just basic things like that, like general fines for different things as residents.
Those things could go up irrespective of home rule.
Okay.
Village, actually, that's the one area that the state has granted the village authority to be more flexible in the setting of fees and fines. Not so much removing violations, that's a separate issue, that's set by the state and county. So, that is a reality today.
Okay.
So I would try to allay your fear from that standpoint. To go back to your first concern, nobody's saying that the village will not tax in an environment where we're home rule versus the environment that we're in today. The reality of the infrastructure investments that we make and the reality of the day-to-day operations that we have require resources to pay for. And those resources go into a very thoughtful process. I think there is at least in the 11 years that I've been in this role, every member to a person who's been on the village board has been incredibly thoughtful about the responsibility that they have in being the fiduciaries of your resources. And as we saw, the village represents a relatively small portion of your property tax bill. It's the nature of how property taxes are structured in Illinois. I don't know if it's a political thing, but it's certainly
Sure.
the way it is here. So I guess the point that I would make to you, and I don't know if it'll allay your concern, is that the intention is to be is to limit that overall impact on you as much as possible, as much as we have the flexibility to do. The decisions that will be made in the next 20, 30, 50 years will include your neighbors making those decisions, right? Your elected officials are your neighbors, they're locally elected, and those concerns, because one of the things that we do try to do is to be aware of what the community needs. You know, we've done now a community-wide survey every 4 years. We just finished our last one last year. What we learned from those surveys is that people are generally quite happy with the level of service that they're getting from the village. They are impacted not insignificantly by their property tax bill. That they are concerned that the village is doing the things that it needs to do to make sure that our infrastructure is at the level that it both needs to be, but more importantly should be, so that it is serving the community. A big reason why we think people want to live in this community is because of the services that we provide. And we want to be very cautious and careful about that. We want to find ways to utilize resources from the state, from the federal government, where we can, to limit that local cost to do those things. And I'll tell you, it's a bigger challenge. As Nikki mentioned, we are continuing on a regular basis these past few weeks, going through kind of the first draft of the budget that we'll present to the village board next month. And as we see, we, like all communities across the state and the country, are finding themselves questioning how to deal with the things that are coming at us. When I say that the federal government ordaining that all lead service lines be replaced, that's a $50 billion cost across the country, with no real sense of whether the federal government is gonna provide any resources for that. And interestingly, the way we treat our water here actually limits the negative impact of those lead service lines. Doesn't take all impact away, but we've figured out the best way to do that, and we do that responsibly. They didn't do that responsibly in Flint, Michigan. And so that caused a pretty dramatic situation in that community. So, you know, I think the point is that it isn't, as I said, a magic wand, but the intention behind it is to try to limit that upward thrust. Because no matter what we do, we have those infrastructure needs. Those infrastructure needs exist in both a non-home rule and a home rule environment, and the goal in a home rule environment is to limit how that impacts you on a regular basis.
Do you think there's a possibility of putting some of those guardrails into like the village charter, for instance?
The
To
code
just-
of ordinances,
Yeah, to just kind of, you know, help with those fears I think that a lot of residents do have. And
Well,
I think
and
it's telling
and
that I'm
that's-
brand new and I've already heard so much negativity, which is, it happens, right?
Sure.
It's political season, but like, I think there is so much out there that's so questionable.
And
about
that
this.
is why the village board is planning to enact that ordinance that would limit that property tax, growth, that would include that, in our code of ordinances. Could it be changed in the future? It can. And that is to some degree, the nature of the forms of government in the way that the Constitution has set them out. You either are or you're not. You can't be halfway.
Sure.
But you can enact those local restrictions to do the best that you can to make sure that those restrictions stay in place. But I understand your point. I think it's a hard concept to understand overall. What we've tried to do is to boil it down to its essence a bit, and I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the information that's on the village's website. We're happy to answer questions specifically that you may have. Nikki is desperate to answer.
I just,
questions.
I'll find this out
Yeah.
before the end of the night. I just wanna go back to your question about debt, because I do wanna clarify that home rule does not provide unbridled authority to the village. We cannot go hog wild and issue $20 million of debt. There is a legal limit of debt that's imposed at the state level that preempts home rule authority. So regardless, we still have to live within our means. There are also governors within our financial policies that the village board discusses every year as part of our budget process. It's a public discussion in August. If you wanna come next year, you're all invited. But there are governing bodies and regulatory bodies that do look at that. So if the village board does exceed any of its financial policies or violates any of its financial policies or draws its fund balance down below the policy levels that they have set forth, there are consequences for that. The most expensive consequence is a downgrade in our bond rating, which would make it that much harder for the village to afford infrastructure improvements. So to answer your question, and to kind of go on to the lead service lines and the $77 million in capital, we're limited in the options that we have today. So I think one of the goals of home rule is to find other options, because all we have right now is the property tax levy and those revenues that are set forth in statute. So we just don't have any more options.
Also, I wanna go back to one of the first things you said, which was that people have been telling you that if we do home rule, that's sort of an entree for fees, fines, things like that. And village manager said, incorrect. We have whatever authority we have on that today. There is no plan home rule would not allow us, if there were a plan, to turn Glencoe into Ferguson, Missouri. We're not doing that. When we do a referendum on a bond issue, it's pretty straightforward. You're gonna pay for this or you're not. The home rule referendum is a little more challenging because somebody opposed to it can really say anything, and it's hard to know whether it's true. So I can tell you, it is not true, it's never been true that home rule is about fees or speeding or fines or it's not about looking for extra ways to charge you money. We're hoping we can find ways maybe to charge some other people that aren't you. I'm not sure we'll be able to, but we're hoping. And we're hoping with the infrastructure to find a way to charge our current residents less. That's why I would like to do it, or one of the reasons. And the last thing I'll say is, because I know people, there are reasons, I suppose, to be opposed, and there are theories that the government could go hog wild. And I would simply say to anyone thinking about this, okay, all of our neighbors, with the sole exception of Kenilworth, all of our neighbors, villages and cities that look just like us, with residents just like ours, all of them have home rule. Which ones of them have gone hog wild? And the answer is there aren't any. There
I
aren't
can give
any.
you one. Would you like me to?
Sure.
Okay. I've gone on the Evanston website. They have a webpage entitled Home Rule Taxes. There are 20 different taxes on that website. So you limit, if you're gonna limit by resolution or by ordinance, the property taxes, there's no limit being proposed to limit what you can do on these home rule taxes. So anytime a project comes up, say, well, we can afford anything, we just add another home rule tax, or we increase one that we've already had, tax and spend, tax and spend. And finally, I would say, the big difference is, every time when we get our second, property tax, assessment, on there, the county treasurer puts the exact amount, right down to the penny, how much we're paying. All of these other taxes, all those 20 taxes, or how many ever the Glencoe puts in, we're never gonna get an accounting of those.
That's not true.
That's just incorrect. Glencoe does not do anything in secret. It doesn't pass ordinances in secret, it doesn't tax in secret, it doesn't collect money in secret. It is just not true. There's a lot of difference with all respect, between the city of Chicago and Evanston and Glencoe and all of our surrounding neighborhoods. And it is true that the village of Glencoe, if it were home rule, would have the powers of home rule communities. It would have the power. Which of our, and you listed, I don't know that the people in Evanston feel that they're particularly overtaxed. And I don't know.
The merchants do. I can give you some merchants that.
Okay,
I can give you names.
I don't know that the residents of Evanston feel they're overtaxed. I don't know how their property taxes compare to ours. It would be lovely if we could find a way to tax somebody to help us that isn't one of our residents. Now but at the same time, we are very cognizant that we do not want to crush our merchants. And we have not. That would be a short-term plan. But like I said, Wilmette, Winnetka, Lake Forest, Northfield, they look just like us. And they are home rule. They have not crushed their merchants. They have not crushed their residents. And in fact, they may pay a little bit less and they may get a little bit more. I understand the theory that, the government could go hog wild, but Glencoe has never done that. our neighbors have not done that. And how much extra are you prepared to pay today and going forward to prevent this theory? Because, you know, right now, you know, we had a water main break underneath the lagoon. It was a big, and we've had to fix it. It was a big project, and we paid for that with our 20-year bond. That water main's gonna be there for a lot longer than 20 years, and that means you paid extra, and you were paying extra. I would like us not to pay extra. How much extra are you prepared to pay?
Okay, we're gonna try to get everybody's question, but we're gonna try to answer them a little bit more quickly than we have, so that everyone can go home. I'm gonna get back to you. I saw your hand pop up. Yep, sorry,
Yeah,
yep. Mhm.
yeah.
Sorry.
You mentioned that, you've missed out on some bonds and some other sources of revenues because we weren't home ruled. And I'm wondering if you could give some specific examples with some dollars that go with them as to the kinds of things you've missed out or we've missed out on because of not being home ruled.
Give me 1 second. So, apologize, my blood sugar is a little low. There have been several circumstances where we have been approached by Congressman Schneider, by some of our state legislators, indicating they have programs available for us for a variety of infrastructure needs, stormwater and stormwater, streets, and water infrastructure. Some of that came through during the pandemic as pass-through grants. We were able to use ARPA resources, American Recovery Plan Act resources. Refresh my memory, $1.8 million we got. And part of the reason we were able to was that they were relatively unencumbered dollars. When we were approached by Congressman Schneider's office about 6 years ago, his comment to us was, I've got resources. I wanna say it was, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me and I don't wanna give you the wrong number. I'm happy to circle back.
Nothing too specific though.
Yeah, it was about $1.5 million for water infrastructure. We did not have the design work completed. We did not have the matching resources available to us at that time. Many of these grants are not, here's $5 million, go spend it. It's, here's $1.5 million. You have a local share that could be anywhere from 20 to 80%. And if you don't have those local share dollars immediately available to you, you may not be able to spend those dollars because they need to be spent within a 2 to 3 year window, sometimes less. We were able to avail ourselves of that for the Hazel Avenue crossing. I know that's not one of Jay's favorite projects, but that was, those were federal dollars passed through the state. We paid 20%, we paid 20% of that, we got 80% through a state program. So it happens sometimes, but I think where I point to is looking back at Winnebago's stormwater project, where they were able to avail themselves of substantial federal and state dollars to the tune of about $30 million, because they were able to spend those resources quickly. They had a 20% local share, 80% federal share. I love those kinds of projects because 20% local share is great. If you can act quickly, they were in the planning stages. They went out and sought that. They could guarantee their 20% share because they could go out and bond for it if they needed to. They were able to aggregate other resources together without having to bond for it. If we could do that, we would. That doesn't always work out that way. Steve?
I've heard a few times how it could reduce our taxes, which taxes never go down, ever go down. Now, if I go out to eat in Glencoe, when I go see a show, and there's a 3% entertainment tax, didn't my taxes effectively just go up?
Potentially.
So explaining how that would work, you're right, to to your impact, you would be paying that as well. But in that scenario, you also are surrounded by folks that don't live in Glencoe that are also paying that. In absence of the ability to enact that tax, it goes on the property tax levy.
You ever used anywhere outside of Glencoe? There you go, well, you're, right, I'm just saying.
As we understand it, about
it's the same
60%, 60 to 70% of the people that go to see a show at Writers Theater, based off of the information that they've shared with us, come from zip codes that are not 60022. So there's no doubt your point is well taken. The intention, though, is to try to recoup some of those resources for those people who are coming to our community, using our streets, using our sidewalks, using our parking spaces, to perhaps pay for a portion of those.
And could you shed some light on why Kenilworth is not a home rule?
I can't explain it, other than, my understanding is that they have not elected to bring a referendum forward. They have discussed it, and I think they just have not chosen to do so. Yeah, sorry.
I have a question for Village President Nolan, and that, what is the consensus of your board on this issue? Or is there one?
So if the question is home rule, the village board voted, I don't vote unless it's a tie, but it's not a secret that I was in favor of home. The village board voted 6-0 to put home rule on the referendum ballot. I think it's fair to say that the village board members are all in favor of us going home rule. And again,
I don't mean to correct you. We did have one trustee who was not present at the August village board meeting, so she was unable to vote, but she did share a note in favor of it that was read out
so
loud.
so it'd be 5-0 and the absent board member in favor.
Well, thank you, that's helpful to me. What seems to me is that it's coming down to a matter of trust. The residents of the village trusting the village government to do what's right by the village. And my feeling is, I have a great sense of trust in the current village administration, but then it's the question of the future. That's what I think a lot of people are concerned about, if that trust can be maintained. So, I just appreciate all that you guys are doing very much.
Me too.
Let me say, thank you for that. We will, all around, we're gonna try every day to earn your trust. But I think it's also fair to say that, I grew up here, I've lived here forever. I lived in Winnetka, my family was in Winnetka for 10 years when I was in college and law school. But, so I've been here for like close to 60 years. The village government's never been captured by, foreign interlopers. Don't always make the right choice, but I'm always interested in the best interest of our residents. And I'm not afraid that that's gonna change. And the other thing is we're not bold. I mean, if the village board gets out of line, it's not that hard to throw them out. Like half of the board, half, it's 7 members, so 3 and then 4 are up every 2 years. So I don't, and I look at our neighbors and, they're almost all home rule and none of the Lake Forest is not going into the lake and Highland Park hasn't gone into the lake and Winnetka, Northfield, so we're just doing the best we can. And like I said, and why we're for this is it's not a power grab. I mean, most people in this village have no idea who I am. I'm not mad about that. I volunteer. The only time they want to know who I am is if they're mad about something. I'm not mad about that either. That's our. We're just here to help. We're just here to help.
Any last questions? Yeah.
This is simply a comment. From what I've heard tonight and from what I've read before, is that basically we'll be getting the same services and upgrades for the same amount or less than if we continue with non-home rule. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think that's the intention that the village board has, is that, continuing what is a really high level of service is a primary priority, making sure that we're effectively investing in the infrastructure that you all use every day. You know, I think local government is the most important level of government, not because I work in it, but because it is. When you turn on your faucet in the morning, or flush a toilet, or walk on a sidewalk, or drive on a street, that's local government. And you have the benefit and the ability to walk down the street and show up at Village Hall and ask a question and get a concern addressed in a way that you can't at almost any level of other level of government. And so I do think the intention that the village board has expressed is to continue that and more, and to do so in as low a cost as possible, to make sure that those needs, those very important needs are met on a daily basis.
And Phil, I just wanted to make one comment regarding our ability to trust our village trustees. Because Glencoe is such a small community, and we're so fortunate, and we run our village trustee election process through the Glencoe caucus, which is always open and enthusiastic about hearing from all of our residents and asking them to participate. So we're not looking at people just hopping onto the ballot every 2 years. These are not strangers that we're asking to make these decisions for us. They're friends, they're neighbors, they're people that live here and have the same concerns as us. And I am just very enthusiastic that we will continue to have board members serve us that are genuinely concerned with our residents and the outcome of their activities on us.
I agree.
Yeah, Phil, hey, just
All right.
a positive comment about the professionalism of the board and that we can trust them. We've only been here 6 years, but we've had two situations where we, you know, engaged the board, the village, to add stop signs to Holfelder, which ultimately got done, not easily, but it did get done. And also the golf course, getting people involved and interested in, you know, adding a new structure there that will enhance the overall value of our homes. And I would just say that, you know, I know anything like that can be contentious, but you guys did a good job in keeping us involved in the loop, sharing what you used when you had the survey done that tested how fast people were driving down Holfelder, and when we brought it to the attention of the board and Howard got involved, because he was on that side of Holfelder, it came out in a way that made us pleased. And I think the other stop sign that got put on Wesley that wasn't part of that deal came without too much issue. So I just say, I think that you're to be trusted. I come from a place where the only reason taxes ever went down was because of something called Prop 13, which is not something that's gonna happen here. So.
All right, well,
Thank you so much.
thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming out. We appreciate it. As I mentioned, this is the fourth of these that we've done. If you're interested in the conversations from any of the other three, we've got them all on our website. Please feel free to reach out to Nikki or I directly with any questions that you may have. Again, thank you for coming out this evening.
Thanks, Bill.